Well, with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We're really glad that you're all with us. This is Getting Environmental Projects Done in Your Community. I'm Christian Wagley, and I'm a coastal organizer for Healthy Gulf, based here in Pensacola. Great to see you all. Thanks for taking some time out on your Tuesday evening to spend it with us. Just a little bit of information about the meeting tonight. First of all, I'm going to be joined by Laura Aguirre, the Florida Audubon. I'll give Laura a full introduction here in just a moment, but together we're gonna present this evening. We are casting this to Facebook as well, so some of you may pick it up that way too. And we're going to record this as well, so we'll post it later to YouTube, and you can watch it again later on if you missed something this time. So the way it's going to go tonight, Laura will present first on municipal budgets in Florida and kind of how those are structured. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the city of Pensacola specifically and its budget and some of its programs and some of the work that I've been involved in here, and kind of, looking at how much the city's spending on various parts of that, and kind of using that as the example to kind of carry forward some of the good information that Laura is going to bring us. And then we'll do questions at the end. We'll have time for that at the end. So altogether, we should take about 1 hour. So we'll try to be done at 8 Central Time. Laura's on the East Coast there in Miami, so she's willing to stay up till 9 o'clock for us tonight. So we thank her for that. So, but we're glad that you're all here, and it's great to see everybody. Great to see the interest in the community. So thanks everybody. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Laura, and we're going to get right to things. So Laura Aguirre is the state field coordinator with Audubon, Florida. And she works to strengthen political consensus around climate solutions, to energize new groups of environmental advocates, and to build relationships with diverse stakeholders. And before joining Audubon, Florida, Laura worked as an organizer with Rethink Energy Florida and political action coordinator for 350 South Florida. And prior to her environmental work, she had over 10 years experience as an educator, inspired by the belief that education gives people the tools they need to change their lives and their communities. Laura is a lifelong Floridian, and she earned both her bachelor's and master's degrees from Florida International University. And she's deeply invested in protecting Florida as a home for both people and wildlife. And she joins us tonight from Miami. So thank you, Laura. You take it away.
Thank you, Christian. Lovely to be here with you all. I'm gonna share my screen now, and we will get started. So as Christian said, we're here tonight to talk about municipal budgets. In my work at Audubon, Florida, I work on our climate team, and we know that there's so much work that needs to be done at the global level, at the federal level, at the state level, but there's really important work that's being done at the local level. And so some fluency around the budget is a really good way to plug into the work that's happening at the local level. And so that's what this is. This is a Budget 101 for how to read a municipal budget. If you are a pro at this, then congratulations, you are already so far ahead. And if you're somebody for whom budgets make you a little bit queasy, then I'll be going over some of the jargon that you'll see if you pick up your city budget and you look at those 435 pages and you go, oh my. So this part of the presentation is for you. First things first, I just want to set the stage that a budget reflects priorities and goals, and it creates the roadmap to execute them, right? So if somebody says that something is a priority and it's not in the budget, there's no money behind that, that's not a priority, that's an aspiration. So when you look at the budget, you really see what is prioritized. Some general truths around this process, though, are that public budgets do have limits, and communities do have lots of priorities that require funding. So the way that those dollars need to be split is not always agreed upon. And unfortunately, we don't have just infinite amounts of money to make things happen. If you talk to people who work at your local governments, you will find that a lot of them wish they had infinite amounts of money to make things happen, but they don't. Even within those constraints, though, we can still question and change the way that funds are apportioned. Just because budgets are limited and just because there are competing funding priorities doesn't mean that we can't still look at a budget and interrogate it and say, I actually think that this deserves more money than it's getting. So there's still opportunity there. By law, of course, though, the #1 budget priority is that the budget has to balance. Same for our bank accounts, same for our checkbooks, right? You want the money that's coming in to equal the money that's going out. So for your city, you'll see in the budget the revenues, that's how much money the city expects to receive. And then that will equal the expenditures, how much money the city expects to spend. And this is the good accounting that makes a good budget a good budget. Remembering, of course, though, that budgets are estimates. So the budget is looking forward into the next year. So a city is anticipating the money that's going to be coming in. It's anticipating the money that's going to be spent. That doesn't mean that it's a wild guess. Like, there is sophisticated data analysis that goes into making these estimates. At the same time, though, there are things that are unexpected. There can be hurricanes, there can be global pandemics. And so the budget isn't completely set in stone. It can be amended during the year within some certain constraints. So the city could pass a supplemental budget resolution after the budget has already been approved in order to make changes. The budget process is a year-long process. It starts in October, which is the beginning of the fiscal year, and it runs to September 30th, which is the end of that fiscal year. So we are right here in the summer, which means we are actually at the tail end of the budget process right now. It started way back in October when the staff at the city was reviewing the previous year's budget, developing their objectives. Throughout the fall and the spring, there were conversations happening in the different departments in the city governments, and departments were looking at their own budgets, right? Like, do we need to add another position here? Do we need more money for salary? What are the projects that we've got in the pipeline? What are our operating costs? So those conversations happen in the fall and in the spring. The staff review all of the budget. And then in the summer, the property appraiser's office gives tax roll information to the staff that's preparing the budget. And then in July, which we're about to hit, that comes out fully baked as a comprehensive budget document. And that's the first time that we get to see it as the public. So that should be available within the next week or so, Christian, perhaps. And then the city council gets to see that as well. We have the summer to look at this, and then in September, there are 2 budget hearings that are open to the public that the public can make comment at. After that second budget hearing is when the city council actually votes to approve the budget. So there are 2 opportunities for everyone to have their voices heard on the budget before that happens. And frankly, there's between July and September where you can let folks know what you think as well. Another way of thinking about this is that the budget process has 4 steps. One is development, and that's that whole process that happens when the city staff is creating the budget. One is approval, which is the step that we're about to hit in September, when the budget gets voted on. And then there are also 2 parts that we tend not to think about as much. So after the budget gets voted on in September, technically it's a new budget cycle, right? It's October, time to start thinking about next year's budget. But we're still implementing this year's budget. So while city staff is thinking ahead to next year, they're still implementing this year's budget. They're seeing if there are adjustments that need to be made. And there's also budget oversight. In September, it's not glad we did that. See you again next year. All throughout the year, there are monthly reports, there are quarterly reports, and then there's an annual report at the end. And when you look at the budget itself, generally most municipal budgets will have something like a budget in brief at the beginning, which is a summary, or there'll be 2 separate documents. You'll have like your budget in brief and then the budget itself, which is the scary, really long document with all of the different spreadsheets on it. And when I took a look at Pensacola's budget in brief, the facts that they highlighted about the budget were this. Total budget for the city is $236 million, of which $60 million is in the general fund. That's one of the most important funding pots in any municipal budget. About $14 million is held in reserves. Those are rainy day funds in case, again, there are things like global pandemics and you've got to tap into some of your funds because something unexpected happened. And Pensacola has actually decided that at a minimum, 20% of that general fund money has to be kept in reserve. Right now, it's at 23%, so they're doing well on that. And then the other thing that you'll see is the millage rate. And that's just a way of talking about property taxes. So Pensacola's millage rate is 4.2895 mils, and it's stayed the same way since 2012. And in this next slide, I'll talk about what millage rate means if it's jargon that's unfamiliar, because it is language that you'll hear when folks are talking about the budget. So again, millage rate is property tax. If you own property, then the millage rate affects you. And basically it's a unit of measurement. So 1 mil equals $1 per $1,000 of taxable property value. In a very simplified example that I'm going to use for the purposes of easy math for myself, if I own a property that is $1,000 and the millage rate is 1 mil, then I pay $1 of property tax. If the millage rate is 4.3 in this same hypothetical property, then I pay $4.30. And I would pay $4.30 of property tax for each additional $1,000 of taxable property value that I have. So the millage rate is approved every year with the budget as well. It's part of the budget process because property tax is an important revenue source for the city. It's not the only revenue source though. The city gets money from a lot of different places. You'll recognize some of these because you pay some of these. They're on your bills. So you'll see the property tax, but the city also gets money from sales taxes, from communication services taxes, or local businesses get taxed. So there's a suite of taxes that go into the city budget. There's also fees, so like the stormwater utility fee. And then there are other revenue sources. So the city runs businesses, the port, the airport, and they charge for those services. The city will also get money from the county for certain things and from the state for other things. Those are called intergovernmental revenue. So sometimes money gets shared with different municipalities and the counties, and that's part of the revenue source. And then you've got like fines and licenses and permits, and sometimes you've got grant money too that's coming down from the state and federal government. So all this is to say that the city is getting money from a lot of different places. And a lot of those places are you. One of those places, which I wanted to mention because I know that Christian's going to talk about it later, is the local option sales tax. So we don't always get to choose which taxes we pay, but sometimes we do vote to tax ourselves. And in the 90s, the county voted to approve a 1% sales surtax. And that's been approved again and again through referenda. And that's important because that money can be used for a variety of environmental purposes. So recreation and natural resources, energy efficiency projects. So we just talked about revenue, where the money is coming from. And now once the revenue gets to the budget, it's organized in different funds. And those are categories of revenues that are basically defined by how the money can be used. Sometimes those categories, those funds, are legally restricted. So when you look at the budget, you'll see it as its own fund. And that's because the accounting needs to show that the money was only used for one specific purpose. An example of this would be like Section 8 housing, affordable housing. So the money that the city receives for that has to be used for that. It's not like the city can say, hey, we got all this money for Section 8 housing, but you know what? We really got to fix those streets over there, so we're just going to scoot money over. They can't do that. And that's why in the budget, you'll see that it's its own fund, and you'll see the money coming into it, the revenue, and then you'll see the expenditure going out of it. One of those funds that I mentioned earlier is the general fund. This is like the big operating fund for the city. And it includes salaries, which is a huge expenditure. It also includes big things like police and fire, parks and rec, public works and facilities, and the general administrative costs for city operation. Any money that isn't specifically relegated to another fund goes into the general fund. So a lot of people consider the general fund the most important, and sometimes the general fund is also the most protected, because there's the idea that there's wiggle room and play in the general fund. And technically there is, but I will say that sometimes when you look at the revenues and the expenditures for the general fund, by the time you get done with salaries, there's not too much left over. But still good to know that if you're looking for funds that aren't like legally restricted for other purposes, the general fund is where you look. The other funds that you'll see when you're looking at the budget organization are capital projects. So that's construction, land purchases, any kind of like physical structure is going to be in its own fund. Then there are those special revenue funds, the money that can only be used for specific purposes. And you'll see a list of different special revenue funds. And then there are some things that are a little bit more finicky, like internal service funds. When one city department is providing services to another, that's the internal service fund. There's also a separate fund for debt payment, so paying principal and interest on city debt. And then you'll also see separate funds for the enterprise funds, those businesses that the city operates. So gas, sanitation, port, airport, you'll all see those reported out separately. So when you look at the fund, when you look at the budget, you'll see a little something like this. And I know this is really difficult to see. I see some of you squinting. You'll see the list of all the different funds here, so that when you went into the full budget, like that multi-100-page document, for each one of these, you would be able to see, for example, like the stormwater utility fund. There would be reporting on what money came into that fund. There would be reporting on what that money was spent on within that fund. And so when you're combing through the budget, sometimes you've got to look in a couple of different funds to see where things are. And sometimes things are paid out of multiple funds. So sometimes it's not as easy as trying to find that one fund. And this is just an example of that, right? So if you looked in the budget at the general fund, you would be able to see the revenues just for the general fund. And you'd see that most of the money in the general fund comes from property taxes. A good chunk of it comes from public service taxes on things like electricity, gas, or water. And then there are the other revenue sources. And you would also be able to see the expenditures that are coming out of just the general fund. So you'd see that for the most part, the general fund is spent on public safety, on fire and police. And that's true across most municipal budgets. Public safety uses a lot of general fund money. And then the rest is split between these other uses. For the budget as a whole, I just want to return back to the idea that we started with at the beginning, which is that a budget is a roadmap for priorities. And so when you look at expenditures across a city, across a county, across a state, and you look at the categories of the expenditures, this gives you a snapshot of what the priorities are. And so in your budget analysis, seeing how much money is devoted to different categories of spending gives you a sense of how things are prioritized and what the needs are. So as you sit down eagerly to that big budget document for whatever city that you're in, and you think, now I've got some of these terms down, now I know what I'm looking for. These are some questions that are really lovely to guide advocacy. And I borrowed these from a very helpful report that was put together from a Los Angeles organization called Following the Money. So I want to give them credit because it's a great resource too if you want to look into that. Say you want to look at something particular like tree canopy, which I know is something we're going to talk about later. You would ask yourself, where in the budget is tree canopy, right? So where do you see that in the budget? And then wherever you find it, like whatever fund it's in, you would ask yourself, what are the revenue sources that are coming into this fund? And then you can also check out the expenditures. How is this money being spent, right? What particular programs are there? Where in the city are they? So we can ask ourselves things like, is there enough money going to this? But we can also ask questions like, is this money being spent in ways that are equitable? Or are there certain areas of the city that are getting more funding than others? We can also ask, is the money being spent in ways that best support the people most in need? So just because a topic is getting funding doesn't mean that the funding is necessarily being spent on projects or on purposes that best meet the need. So that's also an opportunity to say like, hey, this might actually be a better use of these funds and it would still meet the goal that you want it to meet. You do want to check if the funding is in general funds or restricted funds. If it's one of those restricted funds where there are legal boundaries around how the money can be spent, sometimes there's not a lot of wiggle room, right? Sometimes it really is that the city's hands are tied. Sometimes even still, there's a little bit of wiggle room because there's a little bit more space in how the funds can be spent. And sometimes a city or a county will choose to spend funds that are restricted in a particular way, even though there's like 2 other ways they could be spent as well. So it's always worth checking into. And lastly, these 2 questions together, who has the power to change this? And what is the most strategic moment to have your voice heard on this issue? So in the budget timeline, there's a lot of people who are involved in creating this budget. Who is the person who you need to talk to, right? Like what department are they in? What is their function in local government? Do you want to start by talking to like a staff person, to a department director? Is this something that belongs somewhere else? So like figuring that out. And then as far as the strategic moments, the budget hearings are always a good place to go out and talk to budget issues. That's what they're designed for. You have the right to go there and make public comment. And by the time the budget hearings happen, the budget is done. Like it has been baked in the oven. It is out for public consumption, right? So thinking about the budget hearings as sort of like a beginning instead of an end. You go to the budget hearing and you publicly state your requests. But then also because the budget cycle is starting again, we know right afterwards, who do you follow up with in the fall and in the spring so that when next year's budget is being created, if it wasn't possible this year, maybe it's possible next year and you can get the request in a little bit earlier before the budget's already done. So that is my brief Budget 101. I'd love if you all kept in touch. My email is here and I'm sure we can share it afterwards as well. And any place that you find Audubon, Florida, you will find me. So thank you all so much.
Laura, that was fantastic. You know, it's it's really helpful to see the charts, you know, really help to understand where the money comes from, where it goes. Because I've only seen a little bit of that for Pensacola before. So that's the most complete picture I've ever seen. And then I love the questions that you added in at the end that really helped to frame the conversation and how we can really engage around this, which is some of what I'm going to get into. So thank you for that. And I do encourage you, if you want to drop any of your contact information in the chat, feel free to do that so people have that. And with that, I'm going to see if I can share my screen to do my presentation, if I can find it here. Let's see. Whoops. Let's get back to the start of that. There we go. Sometimes still figuring out navigating Zoom, but again, everybody, I'm Christian Wagley, coastal organizer for Healthy Gulf. So again, glad you all are here. And I'm going to, I guess, personalize to our community, to Pensacola, a little bit more of some of the things that Laura talked about. Although I think it's important to understand that if you're in any community in Florida, any city or county, many of the lessons that I'm going to give, I think translate to your community. And for that matter, in almost any community, because I think there's probably certain commonalities about budgets and municipal budgets around the around the country, but certainly here in Florida. And Laura's given us a great foundation for that. So a little bit about Healthy Golf and who we are and what we do. We've been around since 1995. We were actually founded in Florida, but we're based in New Orleans. We have a staff of about 15. I consider us to be small but mighty. I'm based here in Pensacola, and I cover mainly the panhandle of Florida and a little bit of the Alabama coast as well. And until a couple of years ago, we were known as Gulf Restoration Network. So you may know us through that name. And then we rebranded and renamed a couple of years ago. So that's a little bit about us and the work that we do. Again, this evening, I'm really focusing my presentation on the city of Pensacola, which is where I've probably done more work than any other single municipality, from having lived here for a number of years and been engaged on issues both for Healthy Golf and my work with Healthy Golf, but actually prior to that as well, just being a very engaged citizen who's been involved in city issues for probably 20 years or so, following the city council and the mayor, and just keeping up with issues and being an engaged citizen. I want to be sure to thank the person probably more than any other who is responsible for me being here this evening and my reaching out to Laura and really making this event this evening happen, and my interest now in the budget for Pensacola and really for any community I work in. And that's Pensacola City Councilwoman Sherry Myers. She's our longest serving council person. She's been on for 11 years now. She'll be term limited out in the next couple of years. She's been our local champion for action on climate change. But I had a event that I did on Zoom in the fall, I think it was November or so, talking about climate issues. And at that meeting, Councilwoman Myers really made that point that you heard Laura make earlier. And I just had never heard it framed that way, that communities have priorities. And if those priorities are the city's budget should reflect the community's priorities. And I had never, it just made perfect sense. And I think it makes sense to any of us. If we think something is important and an elected official says it's important, and then you check the budget and we're spending little or nothing on it, then, and I think Laura said that, is it really important? It doesn't appear to be if we're not doing that. So I thank Councilwoman Myers for being so wise in stating that. Some of the things that have formed the foundation for my work that I do through Healthy Golf, and some of the things I'm advocating for here with the City of Pensacola, and really engaged in coalition with so many others, that really got started with my service, having the honor of serving on Mayor Grover Robinson's transition team. So when he took office, he was elected in November of 2018. We began meeting in December of 2018, and we served through March of 2019. I think there were 11 of us, and our transition team was led by Quint Studer. Anybody in Pensacola knows Quint, businessman, philanthropist, just incredible, positive force of good here in the community. So he was the leader of the transition team, and we issued a report at the end of that. But throughout the process, throughout those 4 months, I had a number of meetings in the community in which I took the pulse of the community, asked questions, asked people what was important, and then researched what the various issues were in the city. So I'm just presenting here some of the things that I found, what some of the impacts were, what are some of the trends that we have here in the city, things going up, things going down. And then beyond that, just trying to assess what the city was doing well, what it needed to do better. And it really is a mixed record. Like I think for many communities, nobody's getting everything right, but we certainly are getting some things right here in Pensacola. And then one of the most important things was just really, again, taking the pulse of the community and what was interesting or what was of interest to the community. And those things really at the top of the list were trees, action on climate change and renewable energy, and then a more walkable, bikeable city. Those things by far stood out far and above beyond any other types of environmental issues that we talked about in those community meetings. The public really has strong supports for those issues. So those have helped to guide me going forward in my work, but they also guided the recommendations that I was able to come up with, because at the end, I could have made dozens of recommendations, probably like most of the transition team members, but they limited us to 5. So these were the 5 that I came up with as part of the transition team work. Trees specifically on the west side of Pensacola being an area of lower tree canopy coverage and also an area of lower socioeconomic status. So I thought that was important also to help create some of the disparities in the community. Form-based standards is a newer alternative to zoning. Zoning separates the things we need every day from where we live and forces us to get in our cars. So these standards are being put in place more and more communities now. They're more about design, the way buildings orient to the street, making it more walkable, bikeable, more about quality than quantity. Greenhouse gas emissions inventory, the renewable energy goal for Pensacola, and then the seemingly mundane, another crew to clean out stormwater inlets. But that was important because they used to have 3 crews. They were down to 1, and the city stormwater system was not operating efficiently. And this was based on my research and interviews with staff. So the number that I assigned there, these are my numbers. This is my 1 to 10 grade right now on how far the city has gotten in accomplishing these things. So we're the farthest along on the greenhouse gas inventory for city operations, which is probably going to be released maybe by September or so. Some of these others have had minimal progress so far in the 2 years and 3 months or so since I unveiled them. But I will say Mayor Robinson has taken these recommendations very seriously. He has been great about keeping them alive. I know I've served on government committees and boards before where it seems like your work gets set aside and everybody forgets about it. But Mayor Robinson's done a very good job of continuing to engage with me and the community around our recommendations and carrying them forward for myself and for the other 11 members of the transition team as well. So a little bit about the structure of government here, and wherever you live in Florida, you need to understand that structure, because you need to be strategic in your targeting and who you're talking to and making sure you're talking to the right person, whether it's about budgets or anything else. But in our form of government here in Pensacola, the mayor is the administrator of the city, kind of like the president at the federal level. So the mayor enforces the laws of the city and carries out the day-to-day business of the city. In this case, Mayor Robinson, is the manager of the staff, right? He controls the staff. He tells them what to do. The council cannot tell the staff what to do. They have no staff under the regular city staff. They have a couple of staff that are directly report to them that they control, but the mayor really controls the city staff. What does the council do? They really do 2 main things. It's important to understand. They pass laws and they appropriate the money. Okay, so those are the main things that they do. And significantly now, here we are in 2021, we have a first female majority council ever in the history of Pensacola. It's really, really been a great change. And what I will also tell you from many years of watching the council is we have the most engaged council that I've ever seen in my probably 15 years of really closely following the city council. And by engaged, I mean council members who show up at the meetings, they've read everything in the agenda packet, they've asked questions ahead of time, they ask questions at the meeting, they're knowledgeable, they're engaged, they are, you're not going to pull the wool over their eyes, right? They are involved and engaged. And I think to me, that's the most important thing for me, an elected official, and hopefully for most of us. It's more important than party. It's more important than the ideology, because I always feel like if a person is engaged, I've got a chance to convince them of my, my argument or my cause. And in the past, we've had council members that were not responsive. They did not respond to emails or phone calls. They came to the meetings and they clearly hadn't read the agenda. They did not understand the issues. They really were not doing service to the citizens. But it's not like that anymore. We have a very engaged council, and that's a great step forward. And hopefully wherever you live, you have a engaged local elected officials as well. And if not, get involved in replacing them and get better ones, but we have some good ones now. So just going through some of the issues we face in Pensacola, certainly flooding. Most every community in Florida and along the Gulf Coast has these issues. Pensacola is one of the wettest places in America, 63 inches of rain a year. Only Mobile gets more, basically. So we have issues, but one of the things we have, and Laura mentioned this in her presentation, a number of cities in Florida, including Pensacola, and I guess counties can do it as well, have that dedicated fund. Each of us as a property owner in the city is assessed based on the amount of impervious surface on our property. So that's your structure, things like driveways. For me, my little 940 square foot house, I pay about $50 a year. This stormwater utility has been in place since about 2000 here in Pensacola, and it was pushed by residents around Bayou Tahar who were upset about the condition of the bayou and they wanted progress made. So this creates a dedicated source of funding that only can be used for these projects. It's about 3.1 million annually. And so it's great for the city because they know it's coming every year and they can look out into future years and allocate that money. And they've got projects going out many years into the future. I will say that they are, they're shifting, they're in the process of kind of shifting their focus now away from water quality. And this is a water quality improvement project, for example, where they put these stormwater treatment vaults mainly beneath the streets. And as stormwater runs down a street and into a curb and gutter and then underground into the storm drain, it goes through these treatment vaults that filter out the worst of the stuff, the leaves, the floatable stuff, sediments, and the things that cling to the sediments. And at least anecdotally, it really has helped to improve the quality of Bayou Tahar. So this first 20 years or so, that stormwater utility has been focused on water quality. Now they're starting to shift to water quantity, and that's going to be more expensive, but that's the flooding part. And we have flooding issues here in the city. We have flooding issues in Escambia County. There's no one in Florida that doesn't have them, but the stormwater utility gives us a dedicated source of funding to deal with that. And including now these wonderful stormwater parks that we have in Pensacola. It used to be the stormwater features were this ugly thing behind a chain link fence with a bunch of weeds. Right now, we've got these urban amenities, and urban land, all land is so valuable. You want to do more than one thing with it if you can. And so now we have these great stormwater parks that actually attract people and raise the property values around it, as opposed to, the old chain link fence and the weed filled ditch was, you wanted to get away from that. Now these parks draw people in and they're great urban amenities. And that's something else that can be funded through that. Trees, incredibly popular. I mean, who doesn't love trees? It's very strongly supported in Pensacola. People want more trees. We need to improve the quality of our tree canopy to deal with climate change, to keep our city as cool as we can as temperatures warm up. A few years ago, I had the experience of spending some time in Savannah for a conference, the Congress of New Urbanism, which is a great group that promotes walkable cities. And, the tree canopy in Savannah is just unbelievable. And I'm able to walk for, my 3 or 4 days there to all the events and all the meetings down, tree-lined streets and parks, and pretty much be in the shade the whole time. And it's really the street trees that I think are the most distinctive and the thing that Pensacola needs more than anything else for its tree canopy. Because street trees, they bring the benefits of trees out to the people. Whereas so far when the city has planted trees, they've pretty much done them only in parks. And you kind of have to go to the park to get trees are beneficial regardless of where they are, but to get the direct benefits, you kind of have to go to the park. This way, you really bring those benefits out into the neighborhoods and you stitch together all the neighborhoods with that, that linkage of green and using that planting strip and all the benefits, including traffic calming that come with the street trees versus just the isolated trees in the parks. We have some private plantings of street trees that have been done in Pensacola, but not much so far by the city. This is in Aragon Street downtown, which I think is the greatest residential street in town, where they did those single trunk crepe myrtles that actually get big enough to form a canopy. It's great shade. It's great traffic calming. Nobody speeds down that street. It's really beautiful. So the money to do that. Savannah, Georgia spends about $10 to $15 per capita, so per person every year on trees. That's planting trees, that's maintaining trees, right? That's watering, fertilizing, pruning, all the things that go into that. St. Augustine, which you all know here in Pensacola, everybody loves to compare to St. Augustine because, who's first, whatever. St. Augustine spends about $19 per person on its urban tree canopy every year. St. Petersburg, $10 to $13. Where does Pensacola come in? A measly $4 to $6. We're not spending very much on our trees. It's interesting, when I served on the mayor's transition team and interviewing some of the folks that do manage trees for the city, they say if you call in a dead tree on the right of way out front of your house, it'll take them a year to get to it, to remove it. I mean, they will eventually get there, but it will take them a year, unless it's imminent, like if it's right about to fall on your house. But Laura talked about the Tree Trust Fund. That is a fund that developers pay fees when trees have to be removed if they conflict with development projects. And so that funding is kept aside, and it has to be, that is restricted funds. It has to be used for things related to trees. The city has had about $500,000 in that for most of the last several years, but the council has had a hold on spending that money because of a conflict with the previous mayor about how he was spending it. And so the council, again, remember, they appropriate the money so they can free that up when they want to. They did free up 100,000 last year for a series of tree planting projects with some in each council district. And so those are moving forward. But we absolutely need more trees, and we really need to be spending more money on trees. And the stormwater utility I mentioned before is also a source of funding that can be used for trees, because trees are documented to help with stormwater retention, and you can use some of that for tree planting as well. So I did want to mention one place the city did recently do some street tree plantings on the west side is DeVilliers Street, as part of a streetscaping project through there. And the significant thing about this, and I wanted to mention, is that is an area, that area where that was done through Community Redevelopment Agency financing. So most counties in Florida, most cities have at least one community redevelopment area. These were established, the ability to do these by state law, I think in the 70s. So basically they tend to be older neighborhoods that saw disinvestment, in the years following World War II. They may have blight, substandard housing, substandard infrastructure, any number of things, and a local government can officially designate these areas. So City of Pensacola has 3, I believe. These are the boundaries for 2 of them. And so what they do is they set a base year. Let's say they were going to set it for 2020. They would go into that CRA area that you see outlined on the map there and look at the assessed value of all the properties in that area on that base year. And then going forward each year, as those properties are reassessed and hopefully the property values rise, that money that comes from those increases, instead of just going into the city's general fund and the city could use them anywhere geographically around the city, those funds are restricted to that one area. And that's called tax increment financing. So it gives, if you live in a CRA area, or if you want to see projects in a CRA area, it gives you another source of funding there that's not available to the others in the rest of the city. And it's kind of a neat, tidy thing where you have a source of money for projects in those areas. And these are going to be a lot of them infrastructure type projects, traffic calming, stormwater, it could be street trees, but it could also be things like affordable housing as well as and incentives for that. So one of the things that drives a lot of my work now, working on climate change and helping the city of Pensacola both adapt and mitigate that, we have a great source of inspiration and kind of a blueprint for how to do that from the city's task force, which was citizens and some government officials together who were appointed and served for about 1.5 years and issued their report in 2018. And one of their main recommendations, obviously, was to set a renewable energy goal for the city, because that's the only thing that ultimately deals with the cause of climate change. Is we've got to switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which for Florida is mostly solar. So just in the last few months, this past spring, I worked with some of you on this call and a lot of other people in this community here, and we all pushed the city council to at least set an interim goal of 30% renewable energy by 2030. And we were successful in getting them to do that. That took place in April. So we have that guiding us going forward. And that's something we're going to need to start seeing in the city's budget. Right now, the only spending really related to most directly to climate change is the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which I said is probably going to be finished in September. The city has a sustainability coordinator they hired last summer. And I think Laura may have mentioned that in her presentation. I can't remember, but his name is Mark Jackson. He's wonderful. He's doing great work. And Mark has gotten this software program for the city now. It costs about $13,500 annually. That pulls together all the energy use in the city, all the different sources. It really helps to manage that, because it's really cumbersome to do that without some kind of some help like this. So through that software program, they get a lot of technical support and help, and so they're putting that inventory together, and they'll continue to spend about that much annually to keep that going, so that hopefully in the next few years we start seeing that amount start going down as we start investing in energy conservation and renewable energy projects. But they are spending money on that right now through the local option sales tax funding that Laura had mentioned. The city did have a line item in there for energy conservation to spend a little over $4 million over 11 years. Mostly they've been using that to retrofit streetlights with LED lighting, which is a savings, maybe not a huge energy savings, but it is an energy savings. It's mainly maintenance savings because the LEDs last so much longer, but it is a savings for that. And my understanding is now in what's left of it, I think there's a little over $1 million left. They're going to be doing some heating and air conditioning improvements in buildings with some of that as well. So that some of that money is there as well. And then some projects happen independently of the local option sales tax and other things through the city's parks department. Legion Field is a park on the west side of Pensacola, and they recently did a solar lighting project. The technology has advanced with those now, and that really saved the city a huge amount of money because they could just set these poles, and each pole has this little solar panel you see up there that provide the lighting, and this way they didn't need to run all that underground electric lines out to all these. So it was a huge savings on installation. And of course, long-term, it's a savings because there's no bill attached to this, right? There's no power bill to the utility company, and it's clean energy. So it's one little baby step toward clean energy that the city has taken, and they've had such a good experience with it. I expect to see more of that in the near future here. So while I served on the transition team, I did have a proposal done for some of the city buildings. This was their big public works complex, just to show the city the potential of going solar. This would be at a cost of $1.4 million. It would save them over $4 million over 25 years to put these solar systems, PV systems on the rooftops of these metal buildings. The challenge for local governments is coming up with that money on the front end, right? In order to realize that $4 million savings. But one of the times to do that is when the city is re-roofing its buildings. You don't want to put solar panels on the building that all of a sudden is going to have its roof redone, because then you got to take all the panels off and they're in the way. So you kind of want to time that together. So I've been having some asking around about when roofs are being replaced on buildings and kind of nudging the city on that. So that's going to be something we'll be looking at in the years ahead as community centers get new roofs to build in the cost of solar on that as well. And a new community center is coming to North Pensacola, that district that I showed you, Councilwoman Myers. She wants a community center in her district. And one of the proposals that was put in just last week, the architects showed solar panels in that building, because really any new buildings going forward in Pensacola that the city's doing absolutely are going to have solar panels in order to meet that 30% goal, in order to do everything the city wants to do. But it'll be a first for Pensacola, and that's exciting to see. So the city does have a natural gas utility. That is a sticking point in this authority issue in this transition to renewable energy, because the city makes a lot of money off that. They use it to plug a hole in the budget of about $8 million annually. So anytime I talk about this going away, now gradually over the next 20 years, it's very difficult for them to imagine that. And of course, the classic response from a local government official is when you take money away from them, they've got to do one of two things, or a little bit of both. They've either got to raise taxes or cut services, right? That's the classic response. So, problems don't get better by not talking about them. So we are going to have to talk about this. It's a thorny issue, but we are going to have to talk about it and what to do with that money as that goes away, because the city will have to eventually transition away from that. And as it moves toward renewable energy. So we are a very auto dependent city. It used to be my bike was the only one on the rack. Now there's a bunch of other bikes on the rack when I go places, which is really exciting. Got some company out on the road. People want bike infrastructure. They want pedestrian infrastructure. My friend Tim and I started the slow rides here in Pensacola about 6 years ago now. We've been on hold for COVID, but we'll be back in the fall. We get 300 or 400 people out there. There's a latent demand. We need the infrastructure improvements because people unfortunately are still dying on our roadways. We typically in recent years have had more people killed in car accidents as pedestrians, cyclists, and motorists, far more than are killed in any kind of violent crime like we think of shootings and things like that, or fires, for example, or any of the classic things that we think of. We have a great example already of a road diet downtown. First one in Northwest Florida. Main Street went from 4 lanes to 2 about 11 years ago. And that's the area now that's been reallocated. That space has got street trees and bike lanes and sidewalks, hugely popular. There's a lot of other projects on the books for the city. This shows North Palafox Street above Cervantes, which right now is 4 lanes, way over capacity, very little traffic. It could easily support street trees, full bike lanes, bike pedestrian paths on the side, and then stormwater swales to catch water. Great project. That'll eventually happen. It's going to need money. Not sure how much for that one. One that is happening is the hashtag project. Scape, or the landscape architects, have been working with the city. And these are what they consider to be catalytic projects downtown. By investing in bike pedestrian infrastructure, it's going to help raise the property tax base downtown, because people want to live in places that are walkable, bikeable. So it's 4 streets that form a hashtag that are going to see those improvements. Things like protected bike lanes, the first ones in Pensacola, street trees, swales to treat stormwater, more traffic calming, crosswalks. basically designing around people instead of cars and all the great things that come from that. And then also Bruce Beach, the new city park just west of the Maritime Park, is a part of that as well. The city has refinanced bonds to the tune of about 18 million. And all those projects that I showed you, they're going to cost a little bit more than that for that downtown stuff. I think they're not quite sure how much, but they've got 18 million ready for most of it there. The city also has an existing deficiency with sidewalks to meet ADA requirements. They're putting in curb ramps and fixing broken sidewalks. They need about $7.2 million to do that. I think they've spent maybe $1.5 million so far, and they have retrofit quite a bit of sidewalk, but they've got a lot more to do. And I'm not sure that the funds have been identified for that yet, but that's certainly an important thing going forward for our community in terms of equity and access that we need to do and creating a more walkable city. So again, on traffic calming, one of my favorite little things are the little traffic circles that you can put in the middle of an intersection that make it impossible for cars to blow through the intersection, and you really slow down traffic in neighborhoods. Super cheap to do. This is in Mobile. And there's a ton of other things you can do for traffic calming: raised crosswalks, center islands, bring the curbing out at the edge to slow down cars. The number one complaint that comes to the City of Pensacola Police Department is speeding cars. That's the number one complaint. But right now, the city really has no formal traffic calming program. They make it hard for citizens to do that, and that's something that needs to change. And hopefully, with funding, local option sales tax funding being an ideal one to do that with. I had a question ahead of the meeting about recycling. The city does send its recyclables through the ECUA, Emerald Coast Utilities Authority facility out of the Perdido landfill. Most communities in Florida, most counties anyway, have their own landfill. And the funds that fund their solid waste programs come from two things. They come from tip fees at the landfill. So when dumping takes place at the landfill, you know, the trucks go on a scale and a fee is paid for the weight of what's being dumped. So funds come from that, and then funds come from, you know, user fees, those who have a garbage can at their house and pay the city or the county for that. And that's typically the funding for that. Now, smaller counties in Florida that have, I think, less than 100,000 population can apply for and receive grants from the state to help with recycling and solid waste infrastructure. So that's a little bit about the solid waste part. I want to mention real quick as we get toward wrapping up here, money is coming down to all local governments around the nation as part of the rescue plan that was passed in March. So Pensacola is getting about 19.1 million. You see their state and local government aid, 350 billion. So Pensacola is getting 19.1 million. About 6 million has been allocated so far. They're using that to make up some deficits from, I think, sales tax revenue and some other things. But they are going to meet very soon to talk about how to use the rest of that money with a focus on addressing homelessness and affordable housing, which don't get much funding in their current budget. So as I get toward wrapping up here again, one of the things that I'm going to promote as part of affordable housing to the city is that some of that money can go to, there's a local agency that does weatherization work for low-income homeowners, helping them insulate and air seal their homes. And they have a deficit of money for air conditioners. And so if they could get some more funding from local government without some of the entanglements that the federal money brings, it would better enable them to help people replace window units, have more comfortable homes with better air conditioning, and also save money because the air conditioning systems would be much more efficient. So for Pensacola in particular, these are the meeting schedule coming up. I mentioned that the June 30 meeting is later this week, specifically to discuss that American Rescue Plan Act. Wherever you live in Florida, your local government, I'm sure, is discussing that. And then the general schedule for meetings would be in July and August. The city council is going to have various meetings where they're not going to vote on anything, but they're going to talk about the budget. I say they're not going to vote on anything. They may vote. They could potentially vote to shift things around. And the most likely place they're going to shift money around is in the local option sales tax, which is what funds a lot of those projects. They don't tend to mess with the general fund, but they do sometimes shape the lost funding and where that money goes. So I guess that could happen in July or August, but certainly it could happen at the September public hearings, and that's where the final hearing they will actually vote on that budget, which takes effect, new budget year October 1st. So they got to get it done by then. So just a couple more things in engaging with your local government. I just can't say enough about engaging with respect with your local elected officials and developing a relationship with them. thank them when they do something right, be a source of factual, good information to them. I've been working with these council members for so many years, and I always bring them information that I have fact checked up and down. I know it's accurate, so they can rely on me as a, as an accurate source. And I think they come to value that. But make appointments to see them, send them emails, and show up at the meetings, and you can speak for your 3 minutes and let them become familiar with your face. Because in the end, it really, you've got to keep after them. And I've seen it time and time again. If you continue to go, you go to every meeting, you stay engaged, you stay involved, it really does work to continue to apply the pressure, to be engaged, to make your voice heard. It really, really does. It really, really does work. And with that, I think we can take questions for both Laura and me. Let me stop my share here. There we go. Go back to seeing everybody. And if anybody had, there's a nice bravo for Laura. Yes, she did a great job. If anybody's got any questions, you can type them in there. I think I might have one or two I can think of for Laura as well. Laura, are you able to unmute yourself, or let's see, I may have to. There we go. Now she can talk.
Oh, I got an error message, but it seems like I am allowed to speak.
Okay. Yep, I hear you loud and clear. So I made a couple of notes, and again, you all please type any questions into the chat. And I'm sorry if you said this, I missed it, but the category about the charges for services, what is most of that? Do you know?
What, like the service that provides the highest amount of revenue?
Well, there's a category, it's the biggest category of all of where the money was coming from was charges for services. And I'm thinking, is that like I pay a permit fee when I, add on to my house, or it's also, I pay for garbage service, I pay for, I'm trying to think of what services, but that's the biggest of the pie chart, like maybe the first pie chart of where the money comes from.
For the revenues, yes. So it's any service that the city government is providing to the citizens that they are paying for. So garbage service would be one of those. I don't know within that particular pie chart, I don't know with like for Pensacola specifically what the cost of all of the services are, or which one constitutes the majority of that.
I wonder if it's natural gas as well, or is that separated out differently, or is it part of the natural gas utility as well?
So I think when I was looking through the budget information, and I'm actually going to go back and look at the slide as well. That was one of the things that I was looking for. And I will say, curiously, one of the things that I looked at was that the budget does not actually define what those categories mean. At least in its most current iteration. I had to go back several budgets to get definitions for those categories.
Well, I'll make sure when they unveil it this year that I get them to explain that, and hopefully they will, because especially as we have a number of new council members, this will be their first experience through the budget process. I would think some of them would want to know that as well. So,
but I may actually. If you give me a moment, I have some notes on the side that I may actually be able to put up. But I don't know that all of those were defined. I know that sanitation was in there. I know that there were some other services.
All right, well, I can think of another question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been working with communities, I guess mainly in South Florida. I'm just wondering, and you've worked with other communities around these budget issues, which is something I've never engaged around before. And so I'm excited about doing that this year. But what have you seen? Can you give examples of some other communities that have used the budget process to engage around certain environmental issues and what kind of progress they've made?
So I can talk about Miami, which is how I got involved in this. And as not a budget expert, right? Just as a human who lives in Miami. But the entire reason that Miami got a resilience officer was because folks advocated around the budget. They looked at the proposed budget one year. They didn't see any money for resilience spending. And there was a grassroots effort to advocate for dedicated funding in the form of a resilience officer for Miami. And then in the years following, that has grown. Last year, for example, too, for the city of Miami, the Office of Resilience was actually subsumed into the Public Works Department. And so when the budget came out, all of a sudden the Office of Resilience was gone. And so folks around Miami started asking questions. There were newspaper articles about this, right? Like, how is Miami not going to have an Office of Resilience? And as it turns out, those positions were being transferred. But because people were keyed into the budget and asking these questions, the public communication all of a sudden became very regular. We now started getting regular meetings with the mayor on resilience issues because of that advocacy, right? Advocates were saying, like, it's, you know, we actually just need more clarity around this. Like, we need to have regular conversations about how money is being spent. And so out of that came these monthly resilience meetings with the mayor and staff.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example right there. Yeah, I love that. They were paying attention. And, you know, we did get, I mentioned and you mentioned it too as well, I think the sustainability coordinator, and that was something that came out of the climate change task force report from 2018. And there was a little bit of advocacy around that, but the need to have an office of sustainability and a person here to coordinate those issues for the city. So it's really hard to move these issues forward without a person on the inside, you know, on the staff to oversee it, because otherwise people don't feel responsible or they don't have the right expertise, you know, the right background to do it. So so that was one victory here that sort of came out somewhat out of the budget process as well. So what about, I don't know if you use the example of Miami, and I'm just thinking of other communities in Florida that seem to be the most engaged on climate and have budgets that reflect that. We hear a lot about Miami and Miami Beach being so vulnerable. Do you still think they're kind of doing the best in Florida? Have you heard of some other communities that are pretty far along?
There are a lot of communities that are doing a really good job, and I hate to start listing them for fear of leaving folks out. I'm really familiar with folks in the Southeast, right? And so Miami is putting money forward, Broward is putting money forward, but even besides at the county level, like, there are small municipalities in Miami that are putting money towards this. So even like tiny municipalities, some of them that have got a population in the low thousands, some of them have got chief resilience officers or have initiated like climate programs. So it's not, you know, a lot of times we'll look at Miami-Dade County, we'll look at Broward County, we'll look at Orange County, we'll look at City of Orlando, and we're talking about communities that have really, really large budgets. But I think some of the interesting examples are the tiny municipalities that have really small budgets, and they're still choosing to spend that money on resilience.
That is interesting. Yeah, and it makes me think of the example I used with trees, where I showed small cities as well that, like St. Augustine is much smaller than Pensacola. I think St. Augustine's population is, you know, 19,000 or something. Pensacola's 52,000, but they probably don't spend more on trees than we do, but per capita they spend a lot more, you know, even though they're a small city like that. I have another. Oh, and just to follow up on that, you mentioned other cities. I know 11 cities in Florida have set official renewable energy goals of, you know, 100%, typically by the year 2040. I think Pensacola is the only city I've heard of that has kind of an interim goal. It's not a 100% goal, but again, 30% by 2030. But there are 11 cities that have full 100% goals, and I guess Tallahassee's the closest one to us up here in Northwest Florida. Do you deal with bonds at all, or have you studied that and how municipalities use bonds to raise money? And if so, can you explain that briefly?
So that's not the work that I do with Audubon necessarily, but I will say in Miami, like, some of the advocacy work around the budget has been around one of the bonds in Miami that's supposed to be used for resilience dollars. And there's a suite of projects that are being rolled out over the next couple of years around that. It was the Miami Forever bond that we voted on, and that's being used right now for different stormwater projects, but some of that money is also supposed to go to affordable housing. You mentioned the intersection between like affordable housing and weatherization and energy efficiency. So that's not something that I've been particularly involved in, but folks that I know have been following that and overseeing those funds really closely, again, to make sure that they're being spent in a way that maximizes resilience, particularly for the the frontline communities in Miami and the people that are most vulnerable, who aren't necessarily always prioritized when dollars are spent.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I wanted to ask you specifically if you had good examples of where monies are being dedicated to try to help correct some of the existing deficiencies in communities for people of color and other disadvantaged communities that have really suffered disproportionately. And so you mentioned affordable housing, you mentioned resilience. Are you seeing specific examples like in Miami or elsewhere where it's actually like specifically written into the either the fund or the bond, or in some way they specifically are targeting kind of helping to rectify some of those disparities? Or is it just more of a broad policy goal, or what are you seeing?
Both and. So, I mean, sometimes there will be money that's particularly slated for affordable housing, but I mean, then also we gotta dive into the weeds and see how affordable housing is being defined and who really falls into that category. I'm sure that you all know that sometimes affordable housing gets defined in ways that are completely unaffordable. I think some of the interesting work that's happening around that is also happening around governance and around these oversight committees and ensuring that folks from frontline communities have a seat at that. So if the city is organizing a committee, they can decide that, yes, somebody on this committee needs to be an engineer, somebody on this committee needs to have, a stormwater experience, but they can also say that we need representatives from XYZ frontline communities that have a say in creating the project priorities and deciding like in what order they're getting funded or how they're being assessed.
Cool. Well, I think we'll work toward wrapping up. It's a little past 8 here Central Time, 9 o'clock on the East Coast with Laura. So thank you all for joining us. It's been great to see some folks I haven't seen in a while on the call. So thanks you all for being here, and hopefully we can all get more engaged around the budget process, whether that's here in Pensacola or Escambia County or wherever you may live. I know I'll be working on those issues here with the city this summer and fall. I encourage you to join me in doing that, and to join with Laura's work as well with Audubon. I'll send out an email in the next few days with a link to the recording of the event, and I can share again the contact information for Laura and for myself, so you can follow up with us as well. And I think with that, we'll work toward signing off. Laura, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for providing all your expertise.
Thank you as well.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for being here. Hope you all have a great evening, and please continue to stay engaged in these issues. It really is making a difference. So thanks everybody, and have a great night.